pleased to welcome you to our symposium today. I came on at 8:30 and gave an introduction to the symposium, and I know that there was a mix-up with the starting time, but my awesome introduction will be available on YouTube in a couple of weeks, so feel free to chime in then. In the meantime, I'd like to introduce our first panel. For our first panel, which is called The Roots of Far-Right Extremism, we will hear from historian Carmen Thompson, historian Adrienne Lentz-Smith, philosopher Jason Stanley, and dean and psychologist Sochi Kessi. I'm going to give an introduction to each of these panelists, and if you panel one persons are here, could you please turn on your cameras for the introduction? First, Dr. Carmen Thompson is a historian, independent scholar, and consultant on the Black experience and whiteness in America. Dr. Thompson earned her PhD in U.S. history from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and her Master's of Arts in African American Studies from Columbia University in New York City. Dr. Thompson has taught a wide range of courses on the Black experience and whiteness at Portland State University and Portland Community College, including American slavery, Black feminism, and race and racism. She has held visiting scholar appointments at the Institute for Research in African American Studies at Columbia University in New York and at Portland State University. She is the author of forthcoming book, The Making of American Whiteness, The Formation of Race in 17th-Century Virginia, which examines the origins of whiteness in America. Dr. Thompson is a member of the editorial board of the peer-reviewed journal, the Oregon Historical Quarterly, where she co-edited and authored articles in the journal's December 2019 special issue on white supremacy in Oregon. And she wrote the introduction to the forthcoming book, Protest City, a photo book that chronicles the year-long protest in Portland, Oregon, after the murder of George Floyd by police in 2020. Dr. Adrienne Lentz-Smith is Associate Professor of History at Duke University, where she also holds appointments in African and African American Studies and Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies. A scholar of modern U.S. history and histories of the Black freedom struggle, she writes about African Americans' entanglements with U.S. power in the long 20th century. Her book, Freedom Struggles, African Americans in World War I, examines Black soldiers as agents and emblems of a long civil rights movement, with the Great War as a central moment. In her book In Progress, The Slow Death of Sagan Penn, State Violence in the Twilight of Civil Rights traces the devastating aftermath of one young man's encounter with the police in 1980 San Diego. The book explores how state violence and white supremacy reconstituted each other in the wake of civil rights gains of the 1960s. Her work also has appeared in such journals as Southern Cultures, Modern American History, and American Quarterly. My dog is barking for you, Adrienne. Lentz-Smith's works to bring scholars into conversation with broad publics. She has contributed to various radio programs and podcasts, as well as several documentary films, including prize-winning Jazz Ambassadors and the American Experience documentaries, The Great War, Voice of Freedom, and American Diplomat. As senior fellow at Duke's Kennan Institute for Ethics, she hosts the community conversation series, The Ethics of Now, which brings authors, journalists, policymakers, and scholars to Durham to discuss matters of pressing importance to the North Carolina community and beyond. And Smith sits on the editorial boards of Modern American History and Meridians, Feminism, Race, Traditionalism. She holds a BA in history from Harvard-Radcliffe and a PhD in history from Yale University. Dr. Jason Stanley is the Jacob Uralski Professor of Philosophy at Yale University. Before coming to Yale in 2013, he was Distinguished Professor in the Department of Philosophy at Rutgers University. Stanley is the author of Know-How, Languages in Context, Knowledge and Practical Interest, which won the American Philosophical Association Book Prize, and How Propaganda Works, which won the Prose Award for Philosophy from the Association of American Publishers. He writes about authoritarianism, propaganda, free speech, mass incarceration, and other topics for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Review, the Guardian, Project Syndicate, and the Chronicle of Higher Education, among other publications. Dr. Shoshi Kessie is Dean of the Faculty of Humanities at the University of Cape Town, Associate Professor in the Department of Psychology and co-editor or co-director of the Hub for Decolonial Feminist Psychologies in Africa. Her research centers on political psychology, community-based empowerment, and social change. A key focus is the development of photo voice methodology as a participatory action research tool that can raise consciousness and mobilize community groups into social action. She has published on the psychology of racism in higher education and other decolonial and Pan-African approaches to psychology. So she completed her PhD in 2010 in organizational and social psychology at the London School of Economics and Political Science and joined UCT in 2011. She was the UCT Mandela Fellow at the Webb Du Bois Research Institute, Hutchins Center, Harvard University for 2014, and visiting scholar in the Department of Behavioral and Psychological Sciences at the LSE in 2017. So she is the founding member and first chairperson of UCT Black Academic Caucus and served on BC's Special Educational Task Team in 2016. She's also been Deputy Dean for Transformation in the Humanities faculty. So thank you very much. And now I would like to ask our first presenter, Carmen Thompson, to begin her presentation, and the other panelists can turn off their cameras.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me okay? I'm assuming you can. Thank you, Laura. Okay, great.
We can, thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Laura, and thank you all the organizers. Particularly, I'd like to thank Kyle and Victoria and others who helped organize this important event. It is an honor for me to be with you this morning to be discussing the history of whiteness in America specifically, but to be at an event discussing a far-right extremism, because I think it's so important. But I'm honored to be here with such an esteemed panel of scholars and practitioners, and looking forward to offering my contribution and learning a lot. I'll just jump right in. White supremacy and its embodiment, whiteness, is at the core of the far right and far right extremism in America. To begin, I'd like to say first that whiteness in America is a relational dynamic that is as much about intra-racial relationships and conflicts between classes of whites and the state as it is about anti-Blackness and racism against other non-white groups. The prehistory of whiteness in America comes out of a history of European colonialism and enslavement of African people to fuel the transatlantic slave trade. The American part of this saga, what I call American whiteness, taken from the title of my forthcoming book that I'll put a link on in the chat.
Oh, sorry, Carmen, you muted yourself.
Okay, can you hear me? I'll start back over. So I'll start that paragraph over. So the American part of this saga, what I call American whiteness, which is taken from the title of my forthcoming book that I'll put in the link in the chat a little later, began in 1607 in Virginia, the colony that makes up what is now the United States, in the administration of the intersecting, overlapping, and cross-cutting systems of oppression, European colonialism and African enslavement. So it was through these systems, structures, laws, policies, mechanisms, and technologies that were used to organize Virginia's civil society, that were used to enact, administer, and maintain colonialism and African enslavement, especially the promises made and laws enacted to protect and privilege all classes of whites, and especially poor whites, that made whiteness manifest in Virginia. So I want to talk about some aspects of colonialism in Virginia that began in 1607. It first began with the establishment of the English government and the colonial government support of the Virginia Company of London, which is a private stock company whose sole project was to locate lands in the New World in which to colonize areas in the New World. And so what would happen is once they organized this Virginia Company of London and they settled in Virginia, investors were then given Native American lands, and they would take that land. They assumed that land was barren. It was not. It was occupied by Native Americans. But part of their investment in starting this company was that when they settled there, they were given hundreds of acres of land for their participation, for their support. And then they were given land if they brought other European people over there with them to work. So part of the colonization was the start of the company and the settlement in Virginia, and then the distribution of land once they got there. So this theft and redistribution of Native American land without compensation is part of the colonization process. Other aspects are the organization of the colony around land rights and the belief in European propriety to indigenous lands. Also the use of this doctrine the use of religious doctrine to differentiate Native peoples from Europeans. And in this context, my research shows that Europeans were cast as pious Christians and indigenous people were referred to as heathens. They had laws and policies that discouraged marrying and intimate relations with Native American people. They had representations of Native Americans as backward and uncivilized with regard to religion, culture, government, and management of land. In Virginia, you had government and private sector recruitment of what I call working class and middle class Europeans to the colony, using all sorts of advertisements and promises of land to recruit European men and later women to do the initial work of colonization, to defend the colony against Native Americans who were defending themselves. So you had this whole system of the process of colonization that included the taking of Native American lands, the massacre of Native American people, and then the recruitment of poor Native European people to come into the colony to do the work of colonization. And with the idea that by coming in, they would have access to land. So in many ways, the European people that came in, the working class, the poorer people who the investors in the Virginia Company of London brought in, those people then would work as European indentured servants. They were given the hope and the promises of land and opportunities. And they then were set up as being seen as having more rights and more privileges than Native American people, that they were assumed automatically to be citizens within the Virginia colony, and setting up this dichotomy of expectations around freedom and rights was a tremendous aspect to how it is that whiteness began to flourish. African enslavement was part of the colonization process. So American whiteness grew out of European enslavement of African people in Virginia. So as you probably know, the records of the first Africans to arrive in the English colony of Virginia show the arrival of 20 or so enslaved Africans in 1619. The role of enslavement in Making American Whiteness, as my book discusses in detail, is in the differentiation between African people and all classes of European, but especially and more importantly, poor and working class whites. And this was done through differential treatment between poor white and African people through a variety of legal and customary ways, especially around labor. So as I mentioned, the European people who were recruited to Virginia by investors and government leaders to do the work of colonization temporarily gave up their freedom and self-determination and became indentured servants in exchange for land and opportunity for advancement, access to jobs in Native American land. The labor of European indentured servants who voluntarily traded their labor and they did so temporarily and to colonize Virginia until enslaved labor could take hold. Their labor was fixed by law and was temporary, whereas the labor of African people who were enslaved or in some form of bondage was always indefinite and permanent unless the owner decided to manumit them or enslaved people purchased their own freedom using funds that they would earn when they were allowed to hire out their labor to other European slaveholders. So this distinction in labor where for whites, who were indentured servants, was temporary and fixed, and for Black people was permanent. This was central to the making of what I call American whiteness, in that it set up important social distinctions in Virginia society between Black and white people around individual freedom and rights and who was deemed naturally worthy of them. So in addition to that, white people were considered free and were guaranteed freedom and more freedoms regardless of class or status, whereas African people were subject and subjected to enslavement. And so although not all African people were enslaved, no white people were. And this central point gave poor whites hope and assurance that they would have the opportunity to own land and climb the social ladder in the colony. So although Black people and European people who were in bondage worked side by side and had intimate relations with one another, were friendly with one another, got along, and in most cases, both groups knew that there was a social distinction, both legally and in custom, between them based on race and about their freedom. And it was that distinction that was central to the making of American whiteness. So it was just simply taken for granted that the European people who were there and the poor whites and working class whites, if you will, who came in, it was just assumed that they were automatically citizens. But for Native American people, and then for the purposes of what I'm talking about right now, African people, who were in some form of bondage, those people were not considered citizens. And so it's this distinction that helped to kind of give this idea to whites that they were different and set apart from Native people and from African people. And this is what helped to give rise to American whiteness. These legal and social distinctions based on race also had a gendered component. So when white female indentured servants were freed and from their legally temporary fixed term of service, if she had children, her children would be free. And that wasn't the case for African women who were in bondage and had children. If an African woman who was in bondage was freed, then her children though had to stay. And then someone had to manumit her children on their own. So it had to be either the owner or she or the child's father would have to buy that child separately. So Black people, African people, when their children remained in bondage, whereas the white female indentured servants' children left when her term of service, fixed term of service, was up. Other gender distinctions in early America in 1643 was that Black women's labor was taxed as the same as men. So a bonded Black woman's labor was taxed the same as any man. She was expected to do the same work as any man, whereas a white female indentured servant was not part of that tax structure. So they had a tax structure in 1643 in Virginia that said all men age 16 and over, and what they called then at the time Negro women, all of their labor was taxed. That was a way that the colony collected funds for a variety of things in the settlement process. And so they taxed the labor of all men, regardless of race, age 16 and over, and Negro women, and not white women. There was also a law in 1662 that made it to where if a Black woman was in bondage or enslaved in some kind of way, then her children automatically had that same status. And that was in contradistinction to European people whose paternity or whose freedom status was determined by the father. So in many ways, if an African woman was enslaved, in many ways that was a marker, it worked as a marker of paternity and freedom that was totally different from European people. So in fact, American whiteness was so entrenched in Virginia society that there were laws in 1670 that did not allow bonded African persons who had an English father or who was a Christian, which was another symbol of what European people at the time, it was another status that kind of connoted freedom, and it was often code for white. A person of African descent who had an English father and who was Christian, they passed a law that they could not be deemed to be free and to be out of bondage. And this was brought about by a case by an African woman named Elizabeth Key in 1654, who had her father was a former European indentured servant. Her mother was an enslaved African woman. And so because her father was English and she had accepted Christianity, then she argued that she could not, then she went to court and sued for her freedom, saying that she couldn't be enslaved because her father was an English person, which denoted freedom during that time automatically. And then that she had accepted the Christian religion. So these were kind of statuses that denoted freedom automatically in citizenship. And typically those statuses weren't seen as being something that people of African descent or even Native Americans for that matter held. And so, but she did, and she went to court and she won. So this law passed in 1617 was just another way to block African people from being incorporated into society and having all the freedoms and rights of European people. So with these kind of different laws and policies being enacted in these different statuses, even though African people and Native American people and whites were living side by side, this was a message that was being sent to society, to particularly to the whites, even if they were indentured servants themselves, that they were a distinct class of people by race. And so this was important. Another important distinction with regard to African people and enslavement and the degree to which that brought about this sense of white identity and the acceptance of whiteness and the development of American whiteness is the use of the term Negro. So as early as 1623, when they were doing kind of a census, if you will, of the people living in the colony, every time in the first census in 1623, 1624, all the African people that were in the colony, maybe about 30 people, all had Negro after their name. So a lot of times it would be just, male Negro or first name and Negro, sometimes maybe even a last name too, but it always had Negro after it. Whereas for European people, it just had their first and last name. So there was always this social distinction. So the fact that the African people always had Negro by their names, and this is a social and racial distinction. Obviously, European people were other than Negro. So the results of this administration of colonization and African enslavement in Virginia to whiteness, particularly poor whites, is this embodiment of a white identity. So when you have all these laws and policies and social distinctions between Blacks and Native Americans and European people, but particularly for this conversation for looking at whiteness and how it developed, you see that these laws and policies gave rise to seeing oneself as part of a larger white group who were afforded more freedom by nature of their European heritage relative to African or Native people. So as I wrap up and leave room for questions during the question and answer period, I'll say for the purpose of how this relates to the far right, is this intra-racial conflict between poor and working class whites and wealthier whites around legal and customary access to more than just symbolic distinctions between African and Native people, around issues like land and jobs, access to wealth and power, something that the wealthier whites and landed whites were reluctant to relinquish. So there was always this intra-racial tug of war as the poor whites were recruited to the Virginia colony as indentured servants. And they then gave up their self-determination and freedom, kind of took on the status of the indentured servant for a fixed period of time, usually 7 years, sometimes 14 years, depending on the status, but there was a contract. And they did that in the hopes and the belief that when that contract was up, that they would have access to land and other freedoms. And they did. Often when they were, their contract was up, they were given, like 50 acres of land and a small stipend, if you will, to set them out on their life of freedom. So the tension came when sometimes their contract was extended and they were worked very harshly, but they had this constant expectation that they would then have access to all the things that the wealthier whites had. And they had the state laws protecting them against abuse through their indentured contracts, but it was always just kind of this tug of war and this quid pro quo. I'll come over here, I'll do all the hard work and labor, and then in exchange for that, I'm then going to have this expectations of freedom. And then you had that against the backdrop of how it was that Native Americans were treated, how their land was taken. Poor Europeans had this expectation of having access to this land as well. And oftentimes they didn't. And so they were then upset about this, and then this continuously caused tension between whites. So, and this kind of tension is what gave rise to what many of you have heard about in Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, when whites, along with some Native and a few African people, were rebelling and caused kind of an uproar, an uprising in Virginia over the fact that they weren't getting land, because at the time you had to have in order to vote, only people with property who owned land could vote. And so with the uprising and the potential for kind of this interracial coalition between Blacks and Native Americans and whites, Bacon's Rebellion was in response to poor whites not having access to land. So after that rebellion, they changed the laws and policies so that people without land could vote. And so that opened up a constituency for poor whites as being a constituent. And then that constituency and the elites were then became answerable to the poor whites. And so then that kind of was part of the tug of war of whites then getting poor whites getting some particular rights that allowed them to distinguish themselves between Black and African people. And this type of conflict, intraracial conflicts between poor whites and wealthier whites, has continued on through American history since Bacon's Rebellion, through the American Revolution, the Civil War, Reconstruction, Civil Rights Movement, has always been a problem. And so this idea of the distrust in government and this intraracial conflict between classes of whites and the idea and the desire to have a disproportionate advantage in society over Black and Native American and other non-white groups has really been at the heart, I argue, to the ideas about race and the rise of whiteness in America. And I think this has an important role to play into how we think about the far right and far right extremism. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Carmen. That's really compelling.